Merci pour ce que vous faites pour les jeunes africains. Alors, ma question est la suivante. D'abord, mon nom c'est Dédi Roland Olivier. Je viens de la Côte d'Ivoire. Je suis délégué ivoirien et j'ai été sélectionné pour participer à cette conférence. Alors, ma question est la suivante. Comment les dirigeants africains peuvent-ils faire pression pour améliorer l'accès des jeunes entrepreneurs dans le domaine de l'économie verte? Merci beaucoup.
We can translate quickly, Your Excellency. So to quickly translate, how can African leaders possible to enhance access to finance and resources for young entrepreneurs in the green economy? Thank you.
Thank you for that translation. First, let me start by congratulating my dear brother, His Excellency, the President William Ruto. Please give it up for him. I think Africa needs a lot of young presidents, and I think he's a great example of that. And what you do not know, two things. He told me that coming for this event, that there wasn't going to be a formal attire. And of course, you know me that I have to come with my bow ties all the time. And so I hope you still recognize this additional here. It's just without a bow tie. Mr. President, thank you for that. Elizabeth, thank you to all of you and the Youth Climate Assembly for all the phenomenal work that you are doing. What many of you may not know is when the President was talking about agriculture, he and I go way, way back when he was Minister of Agriculture in Kenya. And I was then Vice President at Agriculture. We used to meet in my office very, very early. And it was he and I who brainstormed and figured out how we're going to turn agriculture into something that can be financed by banks. And that's what led to what's called Limo Plus here, and eventually Limo Biashara. So which means agriculture is a business. Let me start with the first question, and I'll take the next question at the end. First is this assembly itself. This is a major development for Africa. As the President has said, we've got 425 million Africans that are between the age of 15 and 34. But that means that this is the best asset that Africa has. Your ideas, your creativity, your perspectives, your innovations, your entrepreneurship capacity is what we need to drive the economic growth. The question you asked about economic growth and development. It has to be inclusive, but you can't do it without, you have to do it with. And so the President said it, and I agree with it. You are not bystanders. You should be decision makers. Look, if you run a corporation, the most important part of your corporation are your shareholders, the equity holders in the company, right? Now, the youth are the biggest equity holders on this continent. And therefore, when we talk about economic development, economic policies, about programs and financing, we have to put the youth primarily at the center of everything that we do. Second, it's not just about talking about the youth, Mr. President. It's about delivering for them. I go across so many countries, and I hear people say, well, we're trying to empower the youth. And I'm sorry, I'm not one of those that actually believe in that word, empowerment, the way they say it. Because rarely do I find young people that come to me and say, I've been empowered. So it seems to me that those that are talking empowerment probably are empowering themselves for political reasons. For the youth. The youth need investment, period. They need a lot of finance. And financing agriculture, as the President was saying, is the fastest way to do it. Can I see by a show of hand anybody in agriculture here? Okay, not a whole lot. But I'm going to tell you, nobody smokes gas. Nobody drinks oil. Everybody eats food. So the biggest business in the world is the business of food. And as the President said, 65% of all the uncultivated arable land left in the world is not in Asia, not in Latin America, not in Europe, it's in Africa. So what we do with agriculture in Africa, we determine the future of food in the world. So I want to see those hands go up a lot, because I really believe the future of billionaires of Africa will not come from oil and gas, they will come from the agricultural sector. Just to tell you how passionate we are with this, President Ruto and I attended the Heads of State Summit we had in Senegal, in Dakar, where we put together, my brother here is here, Patrick Bakwejan, that we are working together with the Global Center on Adaptation. We put together a compact on how Africa will feed itself and do so with dignity. Development is not about talking, it's about doing, and you have to develop with pride. And there's no pride in telling yourself as a father, well, just go to the neighbor to go and feed your kids. No, Africa has to feed itself. It has to feed itself with dignity. Within 3 days, we have, I think, Mr. President, we have 34 heads of state and government there. 34 heads of state. President Ruto was there. We were able to mobilize $72 billion to support food and agricultural development compacts that will make Africa fully unlock the full potential of its agriculture. And that is what's going to power our economy forward, transform our rural areas, give our youth quite a lot of jobs, and so on. I also want to say something about the issue of energy. And I thought we were going to come back into that because the question was about what are those areas that can power the economy. God is good to Africa. God loves Africa. Can I hear amen somewhere? Amen. Amen. We got sunlight. 11 terawatts of sunlight. The largest in the world, 60% in the world. We have hydro. We have geothermal right here. You're doing a fantastic job, Mr. President, on geothermal right here. And we also have wind. So we have to turn that into energy to power ourselves. You know, energy is like it's the backbone of your body. If you have it, you can stand straight. If you don't have it, you can't stand straight. You've got to really make sure that we power Africa. And that's why for us at the African Development Bank, we put in $25 billion to make sure Africa can fully power itself. And back to the issue of finance. I'm a banker. When you go to a bank and you're trying to look for finance as a young people, what do you hear? What do they tell you? Can somebody say something? Collateral, risk. They look at the young people and they think they are risky. No. The biggest risk on this continent is not investing in the youth. That's the biggest risk. And so what we have to do is take our financing, our financial ecosystem, and make sure that we use them to support our youth. I feel sad when I see young people going to Mediterranean. For where? I don't think the hope and aspirations of Africa's youth is not in the United States, it's not in Canada, it's not in UK, it's not in Asia, it's not in Latin America. It must be in an Africa growing well and able to support the youth. And that's why we at the African Development Bank have launched what's called Youth Entrepreneurship Investment Banks. Youth Entrepreneurship Investment Banks are new financial institutions, folks. These are not any other type of institutions. They will create a new financial ecosystem around the businesses of the youth. And Mr. President, they will support them in the life cycle of their businesses. We need to create on this continent youth-based wealth. When people talk about malaria, I don't like the word poverty at all. Why must we be the museum of poverty in the world? If you have malaria and you go to the hospital and a doctor tells you, well, I'll alleviate your malaria, you better run away. Alleviate malaria, you have to cure malaria. Same thing with poverty. We should get poverty out of our mindset. We need to create a wealthy continent. And that wealth must start with creating wealth for our youth. We must create youth-based wealth on our continent. And Mr. President, I just want to commend you for what you said you were doing about housing. I come into this morning, I saw the president driving in with, your electric vehicle. And also, he's a very innovative president, very creative president, very determined president. When he was telling me about the issue of housing, I told the president, I said, Mr. President, Kenya, when it's long distance racing, Kenyans will win gold, silver, and bronze together. But when it comes to slums, I told Mr. President, why do we have Kibera slum? Why do we have all these slums? And people say, no, we have to upgrade the slum. No, there's no five-star slum. A slum is a slum. And so I want to commend the president for his bold decision to do that. And I say that because it will create jobs, it will support the young people, it will help you to have an economy that's growing well, equitably, and can actually grow faster. So well done, Mr. President. Thank you.
Mr. President, thank you very much for coming to my support on this. Housing fund through Parliament, and it was quite something. I'm very happy that people like yourself appreciate what that means. The jobs we'll create, the opportunities we'll create, the enterprises that come with it. You know, many people think of a house as 4 walls and a roof. It's not. They're huge industries that would create doors, that would create windows, that would create. We're going to create millions of enterprises in that space. We're going to employ millions of young people. We're going to get rid of informal settlements. We have 1,410 slums in Kenya. We need to get rid of them. There is no upgrading of any slum. There is no 5-star slum, as you say. And that's what I'm telling the great people of Kenya, that we have an opportunity to transform our country. It's doable. It is feasible. We must get it done. Thank you.
Yes, and indeed, the young people from across the African continent have that opportunity and are driving Africa's green growth agenda. And I like what you said, Dr. Adesina, around investing in the young people. And I'll come back to Your Excellency. When you spoke in Paris in front of the Eiffel Tower, you talked about one of the greatest opportunities and one of the major things that the African continent brings to the table. And among the 3 things you mentioned in Paris was the young people. And I want to open this question to Morocco to let us know how we can unlock and make sure that our young people, in line with this, do not have the barriers that exist to enable them to also get into the decision-making places, but to also enable them to navigate the spaces where they can drive Africa's green growth agenda. And in line with Africa's most important resource, the young people, I want to open the next question to Morocco, Sad.
How can we mobilize international resources and support to address the increased vulnerabilities in our continent and empower our young and local communities?
I invite His Excellency to respond to the question.
Thank you very much for that question. I will answer it in 2 ways. Number 1 is the realization that we are a young continent. And I like what the president of the African Development Bank has said. Investing in our shareholders. The largest shareholders of Africa is the young people. What must we do? We must continuously invest in the young people, number 1, in their education. In Kenya, for example, this year, we had the largest budget, 630 billion Kenya shillings, the largest since independence, to fund our education. Because that creates people, that creates a young people in Kenya who have the requisite knowledge, who can articulate their issues, who can drive their growth. That's number 1. Making sure that they are skilled. This year, we doubled the budget for our TVETs, for our technical and evaluation. We doubled the budget almost, maybe, we actually increased by 70% for our universities. Again, to invest in our young people so that they are ready to tackle the challenges of the future. And number 3, what Adesina said, investing and believing in young people, not looking at them as part of the problem, but looking at them as part of the solution, not looking at them as risky, not looking at them with the eyes of they don't have collateral. It is the reason we are going to invest, we've already started the journey, we've invested the first 15 billion, we have another 10 billion this year that we are investing in making sure that young people have access to credit. The Hustler Fund in Kenya, 67% of the borrowers on the Hustler Fund are below the age of 35. The Hustler Fund today has lent 35 billion. And I saw one of the newspapers say the other day that the government, that 3 billion has not been paid. That is true. But 3 billion out of 35 billion lent, I would take another risk with the young people of Kenya. I would do it again. I would do it again. Because slowly we are turning the corner. The Hustler Fund today does not need any collateral. You don't have to know nobody. You don't have to know your village head, or you don't have to have a fat relative or a tall friend. You just need a phone and yourself. And I have kept on saying, you need a committee of two, your phone and yourself, and you have access to some measure of credit. We're scaling it up now by another 10 billion shillings, and it speaks to what Adesina was saying. Investing in the ideas of our young people, investing in and believing in the young people of Kenya, as we do of the young people of this globe. And to go to the question my good friend has said from Morocco, where are we taking this into the global stage? What financing are we looking for? It is the reason why we are saying today our debt as a continent is in the region of $700 billion. We are paying every year about $70 billion in terms of servicing interest and servicing debt. Many countries are going down the route of debt distress. Already 9 countries in Africa are down the cliff. 13 are classified as high risk. Another 17 are classified as a moderate risk. Debt distress is a big juggernaut that is threatening the future of our continent and the future of our development and prosperity. Number 2, we need to think about new and design, let me say, design new financing instruments. And I'm very happy that the young people in this Africa Youth Summit 2023 have said, we need a green bank where more voices, more, those of us who are not represented in the current multilateral development banks, we are not represented at the moment, where we will be represented, where we will have a voice, where the young people of our continent, the greatest stakeholders of our continent, will have a voice. That is where we need to take this. We need to reform the current multilateral development banks, and we need to redesign a new green bank that makes sure that we have resources that not only fund our growth and green development, but it is done so fairly, it is done so with speed, and it is done so with affordable interest. In fact, I dare say, like we say in Kenya, mambo ni matatu. Number 1, it must be with speed. It takes inordinate time to access credit. Number 2, it must be at scale. Sometimes you get little monies here and there that cannot make any meaning. And number 3, it must be affordable. So it must be, number 1, it must be with speed, it must be at scale, and it must be affordable. Mambo ni matatu.
Yeah. Thank you, Your Excellency. And I would like to unlock on the risk component as well.
Yeah, let me say that your president represents Africa so well on the global scale. if you listen to him in Paris, we were there together in Paris, where we were talking about the need to reform the global financial architecture. It's not just, you can have a seat around the table. It's not your seat around the table that matters. It's your voice. It's the fact that your voice is respected, your perspectives are taken into consideration, and their priorities are directed to what's important to you. And I think I want to thank the President for doing so well for us in Paris. And Patrick, you were there, and we saw what the President did there. Now, I want to make 3 points with regard to the question for... First is, we have to put our monies where our mouths are. The African Development Bank, together with the Global Center on Adaptation, we have a program that's called Youth Adapt. And Patrick and I, at the COP27, with my team, we actually have been financing this. We put in $4 million, Mr. President, into this, supporting ideas and businesses of young people. Yeah, basically seed financing. And eventually, if those businesses then work, then they are able to get a little bit more financing. Eventually, they get a growth capital to grow their businesses. We've done now, I think, 33 businesses in 19 countries. And I can tell you that those businesses, they've increased their profit by 200%. 20% of them are expanding their business into other parts of Africa. And one thing I'd like to say here, Mr. President, is that from the African Development Bank and from the Global Center on Adaptation, we are determined to do exactly what you say, is take it to scale. Put our monies there. So I'm very pleased to announce to you today, and I will say it at the main plenary, that the African Development Bank and the Global Center on Adaptation will launch a $1 billion Youth Adapt initiative that will provide, Mr. President, financing for seed financing. It will also provide growth capital for big businesses that will come out of that. It's a big thing for the young people of Africa. Second is, we talked about how we are going to finance Africa in responding to climate change issues. President Ruto doesn't believe in complaining. I don't believe in complaining either. We have to find a way in which we mobilize resources ourselves. There are 3 things that we are doing. First, again, the African Development Bank, together with the Global Center on Adaptation, we've launched what's called the African Adaptation Acceleration Program, which is the largest program, by the way, on climate adaptation in the world. We know that adaptation is our challenge. We only contributed 3% to global emissions, but we suffer disproportionately from that. We're not going to be waiting for others just for that. We have to put our money there. Okay, the climate is back on this one. Okay, good. And so this particular AAAP, we call it, African Adaptation Acceleration Program, is to mobilize $25 billion to support adaptation in Africa, to support building resilience into infrastructure, which Mr. President talked about, whether it's water, whether it's housing, whether it's energy, and so on, and also supporting young businesses in terms of green businesses that can create a lot of green jobs for us. The other thing that we are doing at the African Development Bank on this is, for climate adaptation, we have launched what's called Climate Adaptation Window, Mr. President, under the African Development Fund, and which Kenya is a big contributor to the African Development Bank. And this is to, now has $429 million that will support us to provide 20 million farmers with access to crop insurance and livestock insurance. Another 20 million farmers to have access to climate-resilient agricultural technologies to build their resilience. Then to essentially regenerate 1 million hectares, Mr. President, of degraded land, and all that. So this is a very, very big investment that we are making. And finally, I want to say something about, as a kid, I know your mother, you were selling things as a kid. I was selling things also as a kid. My mother told me something, that the way when you go to the market and you're selling something, the way you present what you are selling is the way people buy it. What I'm saying by that is this. Africa has the biggest carbon lungs in the world, which is the Congo Basin. Bigger than Amazon. And now, but if you look at how we are valuing our wealth, biodiversity, carbon sequestration, Mr. President, is not valued. So all of what we're doing, sequestering carbon for the rest of the world, has no value. Somebody says, well, I will do for you a voluntary carbon market, which is basically, greenwash my conscience, give you a little bit there, give you a little bit there. No, we don't want that. We want the wealth of Africa to be recalibrated based on what we have. And if you take the forest, if you take the carbon that we are sequestrating, I can tell you then the GDP as a measure of wealth, Mr. President.
Include our renewable assets.
Renewable assets.
And all that.
Yes. If we took that, Mr. President, then the GDP is just a measure of value of goods and services and economy produces. But you are not measuring our carbon stocks. It's over there. We are saving the world. We are not getting any benefits from it. When I used to work here in Kenya, somebody came to my office and said, we want you to support farmers. I was then at Agra and Rockefeller Foundation. We want you to support farmers to plant trees because of carbon. I said, how much are you going to pay them? He said, $1 per ton. I said, look, come on. What we are saying is we must have a local carbon market ourselves, an African carbon market, price our carbon properly, and make sure then that our GDP takes into consideration, it's adjusted based on the positive externality we have. Then the value of our GDP, if it takes into consideration the value of our forest, the carbon stock and so on, will be so high. Then our debt to GDP ratio will go down. Then we can borrow more money to do all the things that we are talking about, green financing, that we are saying here today. That is how the lesson of my mother is influencing what I do as president of the bank. The way you put a value on your own resources is what others are going to do with it. And Mr. President, if we are able to do that, we'll be much wealthier. And we'll be greener. We'll turn all our economies green. And we'll be properly valued. So the point I want to say, and I'm going to hand it over to my dear friend, Mr. President, is, Mr. President, let's now work to make sure that we develop the methodologies for us to be able to properly value our carbon, our natural capital. Our natural capital alone can be up to $6.5 trillion. And so what are we doing with poverty if we do that properly? So I think that the issue for us, the President and I, is not working in the margin. We're working already with the Global Center on Adaptation on that and other partners, how we are going to re-estimate our GDP based on the value of our natural capital. People tell me, oh yes, we need to do debt for nature swap. Yes, okay, debt for nature swap. But if that value, if that nature is that important, why is it not part of my wealth? Permanently. And so if there's something, Mr. President, I think we should really take up for our continent that would transform our continent from just depending a little bit here, a little bit there. Let's value our natural capital properly. It could be up to $6.5 trillion. And we'll be done with all these things of begging others for our development. Let's develop with pride.
I couldn't agree with you more, my brother. I couldn't agree with you. I mean, you've just said what should be said on top of rooftops by everybody. We are not a poor continent. We must change the narrative. Africa is not the poor continent. It's not the desperate continent. It's not the continent of disease and poverty. We need a different, we are a wealthy continent. And we need to properly value our assets. And I agree with you, 1/3 of the world's sequestration of carbon is in this continent. The world's sequestering 30 billion gigatons of CO2. And we're getting nothing for it. And we're getting no value for it. It's not in our books. It's not in our asset register. Right? We have 60% of the world's renewable assets. We have 60% of the world's solar potential. It is not in our asset book. And that is why we are classified as being this rich when we are that rich. So what we are saying is we're going to drive a new narrative for the African continent. It is our responsibility to do it. Some people may not be happy with it. That's their problem. We're going to do it because it is our place. It is in our place to profile our assets positively. And that is the reason why on Friday, a few hours before I came to open this youth conference, I signed into law the carbon market law in Kenya, where we are going to profile our carbon assets properly. We're not going to take peanuts. It's not going to be $10. It's going to be it's not going to be $1. It's not going to be what Adesina was saying. We are going to have a carbon market that is priced at world prices. And that's how we're going to trade. Our carbon assets must count for our assets. It must count for the correct values. It is the reason why in the same bill, I made sure that the Climate Council that will be in charge is front and center, has youth representatives, because they are our future. They are the people who have the greatest stake in our future. And if we do not manage climate change, it will destroy the future of our countries and put at risk the future of our young people. Adesina, Mr. President, you have our support. We will do this together. And I want to challenge the young people who are here. Listen, you are the biggest asset that not just Africa, but the globe has. The president, for example, of Germany came to Kenya 2 months ago, and he asked me directly, we need 250,000 young people to work for us in Germany. Right? That's our asset. So you are the biggest asset, not just for our countries, but for the globe. That's why I was saying the young people we have in this room and those outside this room are the asset that we have. You will form 25% of the global workforce. You will become 40% of the global workforce by 2050. And therefore, you need to appreciate your place in this equation. And that is why you need to be part of this conversation. And we're going to work with you. I have undertaken the request you have made that the youth aspect must not just be on the periphery. It must be part of the conversation. And I'm going to take it to the AU that every AU discussion must have youth representatives. I want you to prepare yourselves. I know we have a youth champion, the president of Burundi. We are in discussion with him, and we are going to make sure that the next summit of the Africa Union must have youth, not as being attendees or in the periphery, but with a statement on what they think AU should do, what they think AU should represent as we go into the future, because you are the greatest asset. Secondly, let me ask you, as the young people of our continent, to help us break the barriers of countries and borders of countries that has allowed inefficiencies, that has promoted corruption and impunity in our countries, denying this continent the huge potential that we have. Young people, with the technology that we have, with the communication that we have, with the social media that has broken barriers, we can form one huge movement that will transform our continent and unlock the potential that Africa represents. I hope you take up that challenge and provide that leadership. We will work with you.
Mr. President, I think one of the biggest opportunity we have right now is actually within the context of this assembly and in the same narrative about how we can showcase Africa's resources to even attract the capital investments. And you've spoken very highly of the component of even willing to take the risks for young people. Because in the context of climate finance and as we restructure our global financial architecture, how do these resources now trickle down to our young people at the grassroots levels? And I'm just curious, Mr. President, and also Mr. President of the Africa Development Bank, what do you think about the declaration and the components of the agendas that we are putting forward in terms of systemic embedment? Is it too ambitious, or what's your thought about what we are pushing for to actually be part of the system and at the table?
With your permission, Mr. President. First and foremost is that if you look at financing, we are Africa's largest financial institution. And since I've been president, I've said that development, if you take African Development Bank, the most important part of that for me is not the bank part, it's the development part. And you can't develop if you're not having equitable growth. And you can't develop if you're not being able to include these 425 million people, into our process and let them have ideas, creativity, their businesses, we put finance behind them and make it work. If we are not incorporating youth into all of our programs at the bank. And that's why I made the decision to set up at the bank a presidential youth council that advises me as president of the bank. Some of them may be here today. And what that has done is not just advice. It's really totally changed how we do business for the youth in the bank. Today, we set out by saying, Mr. President, that we were going to help jobs. We were talking about the issue of jobs just now. How do we do it? When we have 11 to 12 million youth entering the labor market every year, and only 3 million of them are getting jobs. And then people get on the rickety boat and they head to the Mediterranean. For what? And so we decided at the bank that we are going to actually make sure that we are creating jobs in every single project for the youth. We set out a youth strategy to create 25 million jobs for youth and to skill up 50 million young people on the continent. We started in 2016. To date, we have done 15 million jobs. 5 million of those are formal, and 10 million of those are informal. But beyond that, and that is just a portfolio of about $27 billion. Now, we made another decision, Mr. President, that together with the International Labour Organization, we're putting in place a youth and jobs, it's like an index, right? For a marker, if you wish, for every project in the African Development Bank. I want to make sure at the African Development Bank, 100% all our financing, all our projects have youth based inside of them. And that's the way we are going to be a youth responsive bank, a youth accountable bank, a youth accountable continent. We really have to, it comes down to money. It's not just talk. You have to have money to support the young people. And I just want to say that for the young people here, please count on President Ruto, count on me to be your champion for what you have presented here today. First, I can tell you for the first thing that you mentioned, which is for the youth secretariat, you were saying for the first one, the African Development Bank will provide finance for that secretariat for you. The second is, as I mentioned, in what we are doing together with the Global Center on Adaptation, the $1 billion facility, we will make sure that we work with you as we go to 28, to make sure that youth are involved in every single part of that. And the last thing that I also want to say is the women. You know, I remember, Mr. President, in 1994, I was flying from Abidjan to Nigeria. And when I got to Nigeria, I was flying back from Nigeria back to Abidjan. I got on the plane, this Air Afrique, we used to have Air Afrique at that time. When I got on the plane, there were so many women, market women, on the plane. They were carrying baskets with a lot of clothing and so on. And I realized that they all looked very, very fat, like this. Don't get me wrong. And so they were taking baskets off their head. They were putting it into the overhead compartment. And I had at that time a compact, you know, the compact, the one that is like a briefcase, a suitcase. And that's all I had. And I said, I need a space for that. And the hostess looked at me and said, how many times do you fly this plane? I said, maybe once in every 3 months. He said, the women you see here, they may look like illiterate to you. They run this business. Please give us your luggage. We're going to put it in the hold. Make more place for the women. Make more room for the women. I never forgot that. When I became president of the bank, I determined that we must create a facility to support businesses of women on this continent. It's called Affirmative Finance Action for Women, to mobilize $5 billion for businesses of women on this continent. And last year, we have done $1.2 billion of payout to 44 institutions. So I just want to say that as we think about climate, as we think, Patrick, about the whole issue of green jobs and green businesses, let's make sure that we are incorporating women businesses into every single thing we do, because when women win in Africa, Africa wins.
Just to buttress what Adesina has said, are you guys over ambitious? I think that's a question from Elizabeth. I want to tell you, on ambition, you're better off getting 10% of the 100 you looked for than getting 100% of 10 you are looking for. So your ambition is perfectly in place. You need to drive it, because that will, and that is what, your ambition is what is going to unlock the potential that exists today. And therefore, we're going to hold your hand, we're going to work with you, and we're going to make sure that what you see as the possibilities of the future becomes the realities of tomorrow. And we should be able to work together in that direction. As Adesina has said, what is it that we need to do to unlock that potential? Talking about women, you know, one of the biggest campaign issues in Kenya in the last election was a lady called Mama Mboga. It was quite, you know, a discussion and what's happening to her. And I want to say proudly that today, because of Mama Mboga, we're building 500 new markets, fresh produce markets across Kenya, to make sure that that Mama Mboga has a decent place to conduct their business that has dignity, that has space, electricity, water, and as I said, most importantly, dignity. That same Mama Mboga has access to credit. And through the county aggregation industrial parks, she will also be able to progress her business into value addition, into manufacturing in that space, all the way to export. This is the kind of deliberate, and let me repeat this, creating jobs, creating enterprise, creating opportunities is not a by-the-way issue. We must be intentional, we must be deliberate, and we must have real, tangible programs that create those opportunities. That's why when I speak to the people of Kenya, I tell them, if we are going to create jobs, it's not just growing the economy, because you can grow the economy without creating jobs. It's possible. You know, you have 5%, 7% growth, and you talk about it and people are asking, so where is this economy growing? Because they can't feel it. And that is why we're saying creating jobs must be intentional. That's why we have housing. That's why we are working on our digital job space. That's why we are working on export of labor. That's why we are working in all those spaces, because we need to be deliberate, intentional about creating those opportunities. We must create opportunities for growing income. They must be deliberate. So again, as you say, your ambition is in the right place. We will unlock that ambition using deliberate, intentional programs that will unlock that potential.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. I now want us to go to Namibia, Uganda, and Mauritius as well. And I want to request Mariah to take the stage. Maria from Namibia.
Question is to the President. Do you have any thoughts on the new negotiation agenda item on just transition programs and how Africa should position itself in these conversations? Thank you.
We'll also take the Uganda and Mauritius question together, and Your Excellency, you will respond all the same. Rose, Uganda.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, for joining us. My name is Rose Constantine, I'm an immigration development advocate. When the AFD president was talking about migrants, and I'm coming with the question there. First of all, I'd like to share that over 10 million people have already been displaced of sub-Saharan Africa due to climate-related events. And with no action, 86 million will be displaced by 2050. And we know that, I'm not going to explain this, we know what is happening in Somalia with the delayed rain seasons for 5 consecutive seasons. And we know that the recent floods in Rwanda, over 35 people died and 20,000 have been displaced. Most of these people displaced are displaced within our borders, within our countries, our neighboring countries. But also we have those who are trying to cross the Mediterranean. And last month, 41 young people drowned in the ocean. And but there is no legal and other frameworks that recognize these people being displaced by climate change. Last year, the government of Uganda, the government of Kenya, and the International Organization for Migration organized the Kampala Ministerial Conference, and then resulted to the Kampala Declaration on Migration, Environment, and Climate Change. And we hope that all other states will sign it during the Africa Climate Week. Mr. President, my question to you is, how do you see the implementation of safe relocation and mobility programs, safe and regular migration as an adaptation option, and also picking on the continental free trade area, but also the free movement of persons protocol? Thank you.
We have that question from Mauritius, and then Your Excellency will respond.
Can she repeat that again? We didn't get Mauritius.
So my question was, seeing the economic importance, especially for small island development states such as Mauritius, how can Africa and Africans promote, leverage, and ensure sustainable tourism strategies, knowing that us, small island developing states, have faced very unique challenges and vulnerabilities when it comes to climate change? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Starting with Maria and just transition from Botswana, is it? Yes. So the conversation around just transition is a present conversation. It is a conversation that's a must-have, because the balance that the conversation tries to address is it feasible? Is it reasonable? Is it bankable for us for the transition to happen from fossil fuel to green energy? And let me give you a practical example from Kenya. It is possible to run our grid using green energy, renewable energy. 93% of Kenya's grid is green or renewable. So are we funding it? Can we support our development? Yes. So, but we need a candid conversation as to what happens to countries that have huge resources of fossil fuel energy, and how do we transition those that are exploiting those resources at the moment into the green space. One of the aspects that we must address is the aspect of financing and technology. Those two will unlock the potential we have in green energy if we have technologies, and we're very happy. A lot of movement has gone in developing technologies that would help us unlock the renewable energy potentials, but also financing. And that is why we are having a very big conversation about financing. So those two will make it easier for us to have that conversation about just transition. On the aspect of migration, Kenya has already signed into the Kampala Declaration. I did speak to President Museveni this morning about it, because it's going to be part of the conversation we are going to have in the summit. This summit will provide an opportunity for countries that haven't signed into the Kampala Declaration. That makes it much more easier for victims of floods, droughts, victims of climate change to find safe haven. We must, as humanity, realize that climate change is not, for example, our making as Africa. It is not the making of ordinary citizens. We're here together. And we must make it much more easy for people to find safe haven when they are victims of climate change, whether it's drought, whether it is cyclones, whether it is what you're talking about, the flood, the mudslides in Rwanda, the big challenge we had in Mozambique, in the western part of Kenya, or for that matter, the drought in Kenya, and Somalia, and Ethiopia, where we lost close to 9.5 million heads of livestock in the Horn of Africa. We must make it much more easy for us to attend to those who have to move away from situations that endanger life and endanger their existence. And I hope that we will be able to persuade more countries to sign on so that we can provide an easier ecosystem of working together, collaborating, and making sure that we provide avenues for people to migrate when that is necessary, but in a manner that is responsible. And finally, the smaller states, the island states, who have the largest risk because of climate change. For example, the Caribbean, Mauritius, Madagascar, Comoros. These are islands that if we do not deal with the challenge of climate change, could easily be submerged. And therefore, we must, as humanity, realize the danger these islands face and work with them to make sure that we address the challenges of climate change. And that is why, for example, we are having this inaugural conference in Nairobi. This is the first time as Africa we are coming together to discuss our ideas, our suggestions, bring our assets on the table, and provide solutions on this very challenge that is threatening humanity. And the island states, the people suffering drought, the people suffering cyclones, those who are at risk in the Sahel and many of the other areas will be part of the conversation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just on Maria's point, on the just energy transition. Energy transition doesn't have to be just. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to make sure that it is something that allows us to develop, not with what we don't have, but we have to develop with what we have. So let me take it's of energy that we've been talking about. Yes, we have that potential. Nobody eats potential. We have to unlock that potential. And for us at the African Development Bank, today, we devote 87% of all of our financing on energy generation to renewable energy. So one of our biggest programs we have is Desert to Power, which is a $20 billion investment we are making all across 11 countries with the Sahelian zone, which includes, Mr. President, also northern part of Kenya. And I'm just coming also from Eritrea, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, all those areas, and the rest of the Sahelian countries. $20 billion investment that will allow us to construct 10,000 megawatts of solar and allow us to provide electricity for 250 million people. And when it is finished, it will be the largest solar zone in the world. And so we are trying to make sure we can harness the power of the sun for our development. So we are doing our best on that. We are doing our best in the issue of hydro. We're working, of course, we have to do the big project in Inga, which we have to actually do that. We're working with you here on geothermal, with the Menengai and all the others that you have. So all I'm trying to say is that we are maximizing on everything we have. But there must be realism. We cannot power African economies only on renewable energy. Look, today, so we should move away from ideological stuff and be practical. Europe is buying gas all across Africa. Why? Because they have to stabilize their grid. In Africa, I'm looking at, even in Kenya, you had power cuts because of the variability of the power. Other countries have power cuts because renewable energy is highly variable. Now, we need it, but we need to have stable grids to run industries, the kind of industries, Mr. President, that you are talking about. So that means we don't have nuclear. The only thing we have is gas. And therefore, natural gas must be part of the energy mix of Africa to be able to, first and foremost, drive stability of our grid. It's faster to have gas to power, modular systems, and so on. And it's very, very important. And now, I know others, some people will say, oh, okay, President of African Development Bank, wait. Are you not going to be contributing to global emissions? The answer to that is a big no. The analysis that we have done at the African Development Bank, that the Global Center on Adaptation has done, and the International Energy Agency, Mr. President, we found that if Africa were to use today all of its natural gas to do just power, you know how much we will add to global emissions? 0.5%. That's it. And so we contributed only 3% since 1890 in terms of emissions globally. give us room to develop, give us space to be able to industrialize. We are doing the maximum we can with renewable energy, and we will continue to do it. Reality is, renewable alone will not power this continent. We have to have stable grid. That's very, very important, and it's not going to add to any global. It's not going to add to any global emissions. Now, when somebody goes on a cruise and they have a cruise ship, so you go from one room to the other, you play basketball, you play this and so on. The cruise ship, Mr. President, is stable. That is how energy transition is for developed countries. You can shift from one thing to the other, but your economy is stable. For us, because we still have 600 million people without access to electricity, we still have 900 million people, majority of those women, without access to clean cooking energy. I will compare our own to being like on a rickety boat. So if you move from one side to the other side, you're just going to flip over. So we must recognize that no one size fits all. Every country, every region should be allowed to use what it has, being mindful of its commitment to Paris Agreement. When people also talk about Paris Agreement, and young people, youth, I want to really explain this to you. Paris Agreement requires that 80% of the financing for the national development NDCs of our countries be financed by the global community, providing $100 billion a year in financing. That's not been done. 80% of it is conditional on that. And so if we are saying, let's do just energy transition, let's first meet the commitments that have been made. I remember my late mentor, Kofi Annan, told me something, Akin. He said, Akin, the only promises that matter are the promises that are kept. The world should meet its promise of that commitment of $100 billion. That would go a long way on that. Now, I want to also touch about the issue of migration that was raised, I think, from Uganda. Mr. President has already talked about that, but I just want to add 3 points to that. One of the reasons why we also have migration a lot in the Sahel, other places, is what I call a disaster. Mr. President, that disaster triangle is anywhere you find it, you will find terrorism, you will find instability. It's first and foremost extreme rural poverty. 2, you have structural unemployment among young people, which is what we're talking about today. And thirdly, environmental and climate degradation. Whether it's in the Horn of Africa, whether it's in the Sahel, almost anywhere you look at, if you have that disaster triangle, it's going to be there. So we must build resilient economies. We must create jobs for our youth. We must transform our rural areas to make sure that people aren't moving out of those places and going elsewhere. And then we must make sure that we have the financing to build more resilient Africa. The other thing I wanted just to bring to your attention here, everybody, is how we insure ourselves. And it comes back to the point of Mauritius. Africa needs to insure itself against catastrophic risk events. Droughts. I was talking to President Ruto. President Ruto told me that for the first time, the wildlife was affected by the droughts here for the first time ever. And so we have, we are doing water tracking for wildlife. And so what we have is something called the African Disaster Risk Insurance Facility, which we use to also support Kenya, where we pay premiums for countries to insure themselves against catastrophic risk events. And I think in this summit, Mr. President, with your leadership, we want to scale that up. It's work for Niger, it's work for Mali, it's work for Madagascar, it's work in, even for Kenya here, we did it. We need to scale up financing facility to insure our economies against extreme weather events. For Mauritius, for example, the issue of catastrophic bonds is very important. We have to find, you mentioned earlier, Mr. President, the need for innovative approaches. And I think catastrophic bonds are important. But let me also say that Africa cannot support itself in climate finance just by relying on loans. A lot of these things have to be also by grants. Yeah? If you want to clap, you can clap. It's okay. You know, already we are shortchanged by climate change. Why are we going to be shortchanged again by paying more expensive loans? to really develop our economies for what we did not create. So I want to make a case here that we need to therefore ramp up significantly concessional financing at scale for African countries to be able to insure themselves, like in the case of Mauritius. So we are going to continue to work globally to make sure we can do that. I mentioned to you about the climate action window of the African Development Bank. But we want to do more. We want to do that from, right now it's $429 million. We want to go to $13 billion, right? We want to raise $25 billion for African Adaptation Acceleration Program. But most of these resources, let me say, has to be concessional financing resources. We can't take more debt on top of climate-induced debt that we already have.
Thank you so much.
Just to add one aspect to what my brother has said in terms of just transition. It is very important that we are realistic about where countries are. It's also important for us to say two things. Even as we push all buttons to make sure that we have green growth and industrialization and manufacturing, we must also be cognizant of where we are at the moment in terms of development relative to where others are, and how they got where they got using the wrong sources of fuel. And should we repeat the mistake without the rest of the world keeping their promise is the only option left. So we must, the rest of the world must live up to the commitments, whether it is the SDRs, whether it is the loss and damage, whether it is what was committed in Paris. These are commitments that must be kept, number one. Number two, we must also invest in green energy. Today, only 1% of resources invested in green energy is invested in Africa. So it needs to be scaled up, in our estimate, to 10% by 2028 and to 40% by 2050. It is the only way we are going to decarbonize global growth. So these are very important aspects as we discuss the carbon transition. And to agree with my brother that migration is fueled heavily by effects of climate change. They cause instability, they cause conflict, they cause poverty, making people move from where they are. We need greater resilience. We need to fund. We need to make sure that countries have the resources to stabilize, to fund resilience. And that is why financing becomes a very big component of the conversation. And when we talk about financing, we're not talking just about loans, as my brother has said. And especially if we are getting loans 5 times more expensively than others. And that's why the conversation around financing is very important. And that's why I'm very happy that this summit of young people is saying, let's have a conversation about a green bank, where new ideas, new concepts, new shareholders will have a conversation.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. And I'm aware time is not on our end, and we have so many questions in the hall that we would wish to have you all day and possibly have an extra day of the assembly. But with your permission, Your Excellency, I'd like to combine your closing remarks with the Nigeria question. And we also have children in the room. So I'd like to also acknowledge Natalie and give her a few seconds as well to pose the question for the children that we combine with the closing remarks. Nigeria and Natalie.
All right. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Balkis from Nigeria, and I'm a farmer just like the president. I'm a pepper farmer, and I'm hoping that we'd collaborate. Pepper goes a long way with chicken. I'm the co-founder of Grow Public Farms, and I currently serve on the Youth Advisory Panel at the Global Center on Adaptation. And my question is actually coming at the right time when we have been talking about financing, effort, and whatnot. And my question to you, Mr. President, and I'm glad that we have Dr. Okay, thank you. And I'm glad that we have Dr. Akinwumi Adesina on stage also. In Africa, we are known to commit a lot. We're known to make a lot of promises at high-level events and go back to our countries and decide not to do or do whatever we've promised. So my question this afternoon to you, Mr. President, is how are you, as an admirable president that is so passionate about climate change, and how do you think other African leaders, our presidents in Africa, right, can be more accountable towards their commitment to climate promises, especially on budgeting and financing that goes into their climate efforts back into their country? So recently we have seen a lot of countries making a lot of commitment and going back and pushing a lot of budget into it, but there is no action that we're seeing. We're just seeing write-ups, we're just seeing words coming out of these leaders. So how do you think that as a leader, we can hold you accountable for all of your promises, especially the finances that goes into them? Thank you.
Natalie?
Okay, you have a speech. Go ahead.
The President of the Republic of Kenya, Your Excellency Dr. William Ruto, our guest, and all protocols observed, good evening. I am honored to be here today where we gather to discuss the critical environment challenges in Africa. Africa is our pride and we must protect it. According to the World Meteorological Organization 2021 report, extreme weather and climatic change are undermining human health and safety, food and water security. Africa only accounts for about 2 to 3% of global greenhouse emission, but suffers the most from the results. This must come to a stop. But what is our African narrative about this going forward? Africa is hurting. Africa is bleeding. But unless we mitigate the effects of climatic change, we stand a little chance of fulfilling the UN SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. One thing to stop global warming is the need to stop opening burning of waste for clean oceans, poverty reduction, increase in food security, and provision of decent jobs. Then climate change needs to be addressed soon and urgently. Women and children are the most affected by climate change, according to the Climate Risk Assessment Report, and this even gives me deeper concern for our environment. Ladies and gentlemen, our children are our future, and they must be given a front seat in climate solution discussions. I ran a campaign dubbed My Environment, My Responsibility, and this calls for everyone to be a part of the solution to the climate change in any small way, from picking up candy wraps to planting a tree. Climate solutions calls for a collective responsibility and we must join efforts to fight this matter. I dream of a plastic-free Africa. I dream of an Africa free from fossil fuels. I dream of a green and clean Africa. I dream of a Wangare Maathai's Africa. To achieve all this, we need to speak in a united African voice, formulate laws and policies to protect our continent and put it in the work to restore our ecosystem. And in these words of Barack Obama, I will say, yes, we can. I'm Natalie Silantoi, Mini Miss Environment Kenya. May God bless you and may God bless Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Thank you so much. And Your Excellency, Alamin will usher in your closing remarks with his last question. Alamin?
My name is Alamin Ahmed. I come from Kenya. I'm a leader in the Kenya Children Assembly, as well as a child who was part of the Child Peace Summit, which is currently ongoing at Sarajevo, Pan-Africa. And right here is my team of some of the children that we came with. And so our question to you is, what is it that you wish to see after this summit, and what continuity measures are there for the future?
Thank you very much. First, let me recognize Natalie. She's done a fabulous job positioning the children, our children, in this climate debate. Let's put a round of applause for her. It's very reassuring that our children, Natalie, represented by Natalie here, are here to supervise what we are doing, so that they serve as a constant reminder that they are the greatest stakeholders of our future, the future we are discussing. Let me go back to the conversation about my co-farmer from Nigeria. And she was saying, how do we hold leaders to account? And that's probably a very big subject. How do we hold leaders to keep their promise? And therein lies whether we make progress or we mark time on the same spot or actually regress. Our word must amount to something. Our commitments must amount to something. Our pronouncements must amount to something. And for us to actualize our commitments and our statements and our pronouncements, it takes decisive action. Some of the actions that we have to take are not necessarily popular sometimes, if we have to get where we are going. They are not necessarily sometimes convenient, and they come with huge responsibility and huge cost. My position is that as a continent, to be able to put the people and their aspirations at the center, we must allow the people to make decisions. Elections must count for something. We must stop the manipulation of elections. We must stop the manipulation of our democracy. The people must have the final say. And when the people speak, we must respect their voice. It is the only way we can hold leaders to account, so that when we go to an election, leaders make commitments. If you don't measure up to those commitments, the people must have a say and kick them out. And we must get away from the impunity of leaders that do not respect the voices of people. We must not allow our continent to slide back into military dictatorships because we have failed to listen to the people. We must never allow that to happen. And we must work together as the people of our continent and globally to make sure that we lay a firm foundation where the people's voice counts and makes a difference. So I quite agree with you that leaders must be held to account. For example, in Kenya, there are commitments that I made as president. I said, for example, that we're going to bring down the cost of fertilizer for us to stimulate production. My good brother here, Adesina, gave us $67 million to assist our farmers bring down the cost of fertilizer, working with others, including the World Bank, and we managed to bring down the cost of fertilizer from about 7,000 shillings a bag to 2,500. That's a commitment I made, and that's a commitment I have delivered, because I realize that that is a commitment I made to the people of Kenya. And it speaks to what is it? How do we hold leaders to account? And I agree with you, and I want to say without fear of any contradiction or equivocation that we must, as leaders, live up to our commitments, and we must respect the people's voice. Finally, what the leaders from Kenya are telling us, what do we consider the outcome of this summit as a success? Number one, the fact that we are having this first ever conference on climate change is in itself a statement of success. Just the holding of this conference is in itself a very big step. It's the first time Africa is mobilizing itself, putting their ideas, putting their suggestions, and suggesting the way we resolve the climate change puzzle. The fact that we are doing that is in itself a realization that we have a contribution to make. That's number one. Number two, that we're going to carry this forward into the United Nations General Assembly, into COP28, and we seek to influence in a new way, rather than complaining, rather than being victims. We want to be champions of solutions. It's a new paradigm shift in African narrative and attitude as we face global challenges. It will be for the first time what I have seen in one of the flyers, African-led solutions to global problems. For the first time, Africa is discussing solutions that are African-led for global challenges. I think that is the success of this conference. We have credible ideas. We have well thought out suggestions on how we think we can resolve climate change, but still be able to make our continent a winner, not just as champion for the solutions. In fact, in this climate change challenge lies Africa's opportunity to be a global leader in development, and we should be able to look at that. They say beneath every cloud is a silver lining. We chose this time round not to focus on the cloud, but to focus on the silver lining. Thank you.
Mr. President, I think you've talked about the issue of accountability. But I just want to say that listening matters when one is in charge of people. Inclusiveness matters. And that's what you're doing today by having this summit, assembly of the young people. because you are, as I said, the most important shareholders and equity holders for Africa. But at the end of the day, accountability matters. And accountability means that you must be able to match your promises, your words, with your actions, and be held accountable by a way of measuring that. It's not just what we say, it's what we do and how we are measured. And if you don't measure anything, you cannot know whether people are being accountable to what they say. So I think the young people should play a bigger role in making sure that you have a tracking system of all the promises that are being made, of the things that are being said. Because sometimes I have a feeling that we have a megawatt of promises or words, but 0 megawatt of delivery. And so we have to actually make sure there's a monitoring system to be able to deliver on that. I'll give a personal example of how we are pushing ourselves on this issue of climate change. At the African Development Bank, we committed ourselves that we will provide 40% of all of our financing towards climate finance. When I was elected, first elected president of the bank, I said we were going to do that. In 2016, at that time, we had only 9% of our total financing in climate, for climate finance. 3 years after, we went from 9% to 35% of our total lending for climate. Now, this year, we are at 45%, which is way above the 40% that we actually promised. We said on adaptation that we will, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who I thought he was going to be able to join us today, but he's not. He's going to be here, I understand, tomorrow. That we should all devote 50% to climate mitigation and 50% to climate adaptation across the world, but all institutions. For us at the African Development Bank today, today, we are at 63% of all our financing for climate going into adaptation. We have exceeded. In fact, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon were together, Guterres were together in Paris, and he said the rest of the world should follow the example of the African Development Bank when it comes to climate adaptation, because we have the highest percentage of our financing being devoted to climate adaptation, because we live in that reality. That's my reality as president of the African Development Bank in charge of a continent. So accountability matters. We have to continue to drive and so on. Just to close, Mr. President, the thing that I want to say is we will need you and other African leaders on how we get the SDRs rechanneled to Africa, the special drawing rights. Look, we are looking for resources on how we're going to deal with this global, but there's not a whole lot of money hanging around. One instrument, one vehicle that can have a potential transformative impact in solving this problem is the special drawing rights that the IMF had. The IMF issued $650 billion of special drawing rights. Africa got $33 billion of that. And you, our heads of state, have been asking for those that received it in the developed countries, wealthy countries, and don't need it, to rechannel it towards Africa. You've asked for $100 billion of that to be done. Now, there had been some challenges with that, because we have to make sure that these special drawing rights, and I'm saying this because I want to enlist you as young people in support of this agenda. There are technical issues that had to be solved to make sure that those that give us the SDRs are not going to lose the SDR. It's a reserve asset that you're not going to lose. We've solved that problem now. The African Development Bank again took the lead globally on this issue, together with the Inter-American Development Bank. We came up with a framework that every single dollar of SDR will be leveraged. You can do it 4 to 5 times. So that will complement what the IMF is already doing. So if we were to get $20 billion, and that will easily become $100 billion for Africa. And why is it globally that we cannot have special drawing rights of $500 billion issued? It will raise $2.5 trillion. Right there, right? we need about $3 trillion to deal with all these issues. We can do that, but it needs leadership. So I want to ask, I want to request that you, as Mr. President, continue to help us with other leaders in making this case. Those that hold the SDRs lose nothing. You cannot lose it. Look, as African Development Bank, we're a AAA rated financial institution. You cannot lose money. So you're not going to lose your money. And it costs you nothing, but it will allow us to solve a problem. So for this summit, Mr. President, I'm hoping that a key outcome for us will be to push this agenda of the special drawing rights rechanneling to Africa through the African Development Bank so we can leverage the resources that we need. Money is important. We can talk all we want, but if we don't have the financing, we can't solve the problem. And I think the special drawing rights is just the way to do that. Let me close by really offering to you, Mr. President, my admiration for you, your leadership, your convening us, you're giving us this platform, and for being a champion and a relentless champion for issues that affect Africa. I consider you a friend, but you are an inspiring leader, and an inspiring leader that we need at this time for this continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. Thank you so much, Dr. Adesina. Sorry, thank you so much. And I think I will be doing a lot of injustice if I do not acknowledge all the young people from across the African continent in this room who have put their energy and efforts in putting together the African Youth Climate Declaration, which we have handed to you, Your Excellency, to champion for us at the Africa Climate Summit, and also our partners that have supported us in this assembly. And to mention but a few, we have Rome Electric, and for sure we did see, Your Excellency, you came in with the electric car, which was really great. And we have KIN, we had the UK government, the Swedish government, UNDP, UNICEF, ARCOI, the Green Africa Youth Organization, Stockholm Environment Institute, we have PAPAS, we also have the Global Center for Adaptation, and we have the CEO with us here today. And we also have the Wangari Maathai Foundation, WWF, the CECG, GCA at the same time. And we want to acknowledge all our partners and also appreciate all the support that we have received. And we also have the Dutch ambassador with us here today. And we're very much grateful for all our partners for the support that we have here today. Let us appreciate everybody for all the support. And I'm now